The autumn of 1891 had settled upon London with a particularly melancholy disposition, wrapping our beloved city in a shroud of persistent fog that seemed to mirror the gloom which had descended upon my own spirits. It was on a Tuesday morning, the 15th of October, that I found myself seated in our familiar lodgings at 221B Baker Street, watching my companion Sherlock Holmes with a mixture of concern and fascination as he pursued his latest chemical experiment with an intensity that bordered upon the obsessive. For 3 days, Holmes had scarcely spoken a word, save to mutter the occasional observation about the properties of certain alkaloids. His aquiline features, already sharp by nature, had grown positively gaunt from lack of proper nourishment, and his grey eyes possessed that peculiar brightness which I had learned to associate with either the heights of intellectual triumph or the depths of narcotic indulgence. Given the absence of any stimulating case to occupy his remarkable faculties, I feared the latter. The sitting room bore testament to his restless energy. Papers scattered across every available surface, chemical apparatus arranged in bewildering complexity upon the side table, and the air thick with the acrid smell of various compounds that made my medical training rebel against the assault upon my respiratory system. Mrs. Hudson had long since ceased her attempts to restore order, limiting herself to the occasional disapproving glance and the provision of meals that went largely untouched. "Holmes," I ventured, setting aside my copy of The Times, "you cannot continue in this manner. When did you last take proper food, or sleep for that matter?" He looked up from his retort, his hawk-like profile silhouetted against the wan light filtering through our grimy windows. "Sleep is for those whose minds are not tormented by the vast stupidity of the criminal classes, Watson. As for food," he gestured dismissively toward a plate of Mrs. Hudson's excellent kippers, which had grown cold and unappetizing hours ago. "The body is merely the servant of the intellect. At present, my intellect requires stimulation of a different sort." I was about to launch into my familiar lecture regarding the interdependence of physical and mental well-being when the sharp rap of the door-knocker echoed through the building. Mrs. Hudson's voice drifted up from below, followed by the measured tread of footsteps upon our 17 stairs. Holmes's entire demeanor transformed in an instant. His languid pose straightened, his eyes sharpened, and that peculiar smile which I knew so well began to play about his thin lips. "A visitor, Watson. Female by the lightness of step, working class, judging by the hesitation. She is unaccustomed to such surroundings as ours. Distressed, certainly, but determined. Note how she paused at the 13th step, a moment of doubt quickly overcome." He had moved to the window and was peering down at the street below through a gap in the curtain. "Ah, she has come alone, despite the early hour and the reputation of our neighborhood. Whatever brings her here must be of considerable urgency." Mrs. Hudson's knock preceded her announcement. "A young woman to see you, Mr. Holmes. Says it's most urgent and she won't be turned away." "Show her up, Mrs. Hudson, and perhaps you might bring tea for 3. Our guest appears to have traveled some distance." The woman who entered our sitting room was indeed of humble station, though she carried herself with a dignity that spoke well of her character. She appeared to be perhaps 30 years of age, with auburn hair pulled back severely beneath a simple black bonnet, and hands that bore the telltale marks of domestic service. Her dress, while plain and well-worn, was scrupulously clean, and her brown eyes held an intelligence that immediately commanded respect. "Mr. Holmes," she began, her voice carrying the soft burr of the West Country, "I am Sarah Whitmore, lady's maid to, that is, formerly in the service of Lady Cordelia Wrexham of Wrexham House in Belgravia. I have come to you because—" She faltered, her composure threatening to crack. "Because something terrible has happened, and the police will not listen to reason." Holmes had been studying her with that peculiar intensity he reserved for particularly interesting specimens. "Pray be seated, Miss Whitmore. Dr. Watson, might you assist our guest with her coat? Now then," he continued, settling himself in his chair and steepling his fingers beneath his chin, "you say the police will not listen. This suggests that you have already approached the official authorities with your concerns, and that they have dismissed them. Lady Cordelia Wrexham, the name is familiar, widow of Sir Reginald Wrexham, who made his fortune in railways and died some 7 years ago. She would be, 63 years of age? Lives alone save for her domestic staff?" Miss Whitmore's eyes widened. How could you possibly know? The Times social columns, Miss Whitmore, are a treasure trove of information for those who know how to read them. But pray continue. What has befallen your mistress? The young woman accepted the cup of tea I offered her with trembling hands. Lady Wrexham is dead, Mr. Holmes, found 3 days ago in her private sitting room. The police surgeon says it was her heart. She had suffered from weakness in that quarter for some time. But I know as surely as I sit here before you that my lady was murdered. Murder is a serious accusation, I interjected gently. What leads you to such a conclusion? Miss Whitmore's jaw set with determination. Lady Wrexham was frightened, Dr. Watson. In the weeks before her death, she became increasingly agitated about something. She would lock herself in her sitting room for hours, going through old papers and documents. She dismissed most of the staff, keeping only myself and Hobson, the butler, and Mrs. Carey, the cook. She spoke of changing her will, of righting old wrongs. And then, the very night before she died, she told me she had discovered something that would shake the foundations of London society. Holmes leaned forward, his grey eyes alight with interest. These are suggestive circumstances, certainly, but the official verdict? Natural death by heart failure. Inspector Bradshaw of Scotland Yard was most dismissive when I attempted to share my concerns. He suggested that servants often harbour fanciful notions when their comfortable positions are threatened by a death in the household. And what of the estate, the will? Miss Whitmore's expression grew troubled. That is where the matter becomes even more mysterious, Mr. Holmes. Lady Wrexham's solicitor, Mr. Pemberton of Gray's Inn, came to read the will yesterday. According to the document he produced, my lady left the entirety of her fortune, some £40,000, to a nephew, one Mr. Charles Wrexham, who claims to be the son of Sir Reginald's younger brother, who died in India many years ago. Claims to be? Holmes's voice had grown sharp. None of us had ever heard of this nephew before, Mr. Holmes. Lady Wrexham spoke often of her late husband's family, and she never mentioned any surviving relatives. Yet this Mr. Charles Wrexham appeared the very day after my lady's death, bearing documents that supposedly prove his identity and his claim to the inheritance. I found myself leaning forward, caught up in the mystery despite myself. What manner of man is this Charles Wrexham? He appears to be perhaps 40 years of age, Miss Whitmore replied. Well-dressed, well-spoken, with the bearing of a gentleman. He has dark hair and pale blue eyes, and a scar across his left temple that he claims came from a childhood accident in Bombay. He speaks with authority about the family history, and seems familiar with the house, though I cannot recall ever seeing him before this week. Holmes had risen and was pacing before the fireplace, his hands clasped behind his back. You mentioned that Lady Wrexham spoke of changing her will. Did she give any indication of her intentions? She said she had been deceived for many years, and that the truth would come to light before she died. She also made several references to the portrait, a painting of Sir Reginald that hangs in the main hall. It had recently been restored by a gentleman from the continent, a Monsieur Beaumont. My lady seemed quite agitated about the restoration, though I could see no reason for concern. The portrait looked much as it always had. When was this restoration completed? Just a fortnight before her death. Monsieur Beaumont worked on the painting for several weeks, often in my lady's private sitting room. She would watch him work for hours, asking many questions about his techniques and the history of the painting. Holmes paused in his pacing. And where is this Monsieur Beaumont now? Gone, Mr. Holmes. He departed London the very morning after Lady Wrexham's death. Most peculiar, as he had spoken of remaining in the city for several more weeks to complete other commissions. The silence that followed was broken only by the crackling of our fire and the distant sounds of London awakening to another day. Holmes had resumed his restless pacing, and I could practically hear the wheels of his remarkable mind turning as he processed the information our visitor had provided. Miss Whitmore, he said at length, you paint a picture of curious circumstances indeed. A sudden death, a mysterious heir, a departed art restorer, and a frightened woman who spoke of revelations that died with her. Tell me, what happened to Lady Wrexham's personal effects? Her papers? Mr. Charles Wrexham claimed them immediately, along with all the contents of her private sitting room. He said it was his right as heir, and Mr. Pemberton supported his claim. I was not permitted to sort through her belongings as I had hoped. And the portrait of Sir Reginald? Miss Whitmore's face darkened. That is perhaps the strangest aspect of this entire affair, Mr. Holmes. The portrait has disappeared. Mr. Charles Wrexham claims it was stolen, presumably by the same thieves who took several valuable pieces of silver from the dining room. But I find it difficult to believe that common thieves would trouble themselves with such a large and unwieldy item when there were far more portable valuables available. Holmes stopped his pacing abruptly and fixed our visitor with a penetrating stare. Miss Whitmore, I perceive that you have not told us everything. There is something more, some detail or observation, that you fear may sound foolish or incredible. Pray do not hesitate. In my experience, it is often the seemingly insignificant details that prove most illuminating. The young woman's composure finally cracked, and tears began to flow down her cheeks. Oh, Mr. Holmes, I fear you will think me mad, but I swear by all that is holy that what I tell you is true. The night Lady Wrexham died, I heard voices in her sitting room well past midnight. 2 voices speaking in hushed but urgent tones. One was my lady's voice, but the other— She paused, struggling to compose herself. The other voice seemed to come from the portrait itself. I know how that sounds, but I heard it distinctly through the door. Holmes and I exchanged glances. What did you hear of their conversation? I asked gently. I could not make out the words clearly, but the tone was argumentative. My lady sounded distressed, even frightened. The other voice was deeper, more commanding. The conversation lasted perhaps a quarter of an hour, and then all was silent. I lingered in the hallway for some time, but heard no further sound. In the morning, I found my lady dead in her chair, and the portrait was gone. Holmes resumed his seat, his expression grave. Miss Whitmore, you have brought us a most intriguing puzzle. While I cannot promise you a swift resolution, I can assure you that Dr. Watson and I will investigate these circumstances with the utmost thoroughness. In the meantime, I must ask you to remain in London and to say nothing of your visit here to anyone, particularly not to Mr. Charles Wrexham or his solicitor. But, sir, I have no means of support now that Lady Wrexham is gone, and Mr. Charles Wrexham has made it clear that my services are no longer required. Holmes waved dismissively. You need have no concern on that score. Doctor, Watson will provide you with funds sufficient for modest lodgings, and should our investigation prove successful, I have no doubt that you will find your loyalty to your late mistress appropriately rewarded. After Miss Whitmore had departed, clutching my card with the address of a respectable boarding house in Bloomsbury, Holmes stood before our window, gazing out at the fog-shrouded street below. Well, Watson, he said at length, it appears that our period of inactivity has come to an end. We have before us a case that promises to test even our combined abilities. A mysterious death, a vanished fortune, a missing portrait, and a woman who claimed to hear voices from beyond the grave. You cannot seriously credit her story about the portrait speaking, I protested. Holmes turned to me with that enigmatic smile I knew so well. My dear fellow, in my experience, when witnesses report impossible things, it is usually because they have witnessed something quite possible, but have misunderstood its true nature. Miss Whitmore heard 2 voices in that room. Of that I am certain. The question is not whether the portrait spoke, but rather how the illusion was created and why. Then you believe her story about the murder? I believe that Lady Cordelia Wrexham died under circumstances that merit investigation. Whether her death was murder remains to be determined. However, the sudden appearance of a previously unknown heir, combined with the disappearance of both the woman's personal papers and a recently restored portrait, suggests a conspiracy of considerable sophistication. Holmes moved to his desk and began gathering various items into his coat pockets, his magnifying glass, a measuring tape, and several small bottles of chemical reagents that I had learned not to question. Our first step must be to examine the scene of Lady Wrexham's death. I trust you have no pressing medical appointments this afternoon, Watson? None that cannot be postponed, I replied, already reaching for my own coat. But how do you propose we gain access to Wrexham House? Surely this mysterious nephew will not welcome our investigation. Leave that to me, my dear fellow. In my experience, there are always servants' entrances and kindly disposed neighbours who can provide access to those with sufficient ingenuity. Besides, I find myself most curious about this Monsieur Beaumont and his restoration techniques. Art forgers, Watson, are among the most dangerous criminals of our age. They possess not only the skill to deceive the eye, but often the intelligence to construct elaborate schemes around their deceptions. As we prepared to venture forth into the foggy London afternoon, I found myself filled with that familiar mixture of anticipation and apprehension that always accompanied the beginning of one of Holmes's investigations. The case of Lady Wrexham's death promised to be as complex as any we had encountered, involving as it did questions of identity, inheritance, and artistic deception that struck at the very heart of London's social fabric. Little did I know as we descended into the swirling mists of Baker Street that the affair of the widow's portrait would prove to be one of the most dangerous and psychologically challenging cases of our long partnership, one that would force us to question not only the nature of truth and deception, but the very foundations upon which we had built our understanding of justice and human nature. The journey to Belgravia through London's labyrinthine streets provided ample opportunity for Holmes to outline his preliminary theories regarding the death of Lady Cordelia Wrexham. As our hansom cab navigated the increasingly congested thoroughfares, he spoke in the measured tones I had come to associate with his most penetrating analytical moods. Consider, Watson, the sequence of events as related by Miss Whitmore. A wealthy widow living in relative isolation becomes agitated about some discovery she has made. She speaks of changing her will and righting old wrongs. Within a fortnight of completing the restoration of her late husband's portrait, she is found dead under circumstances that appear natural but arouse suspicion in her most trusted servant. Immediately following her death, a previously unknown heir appears with documentation supporting his claim to her entire fortune, while the restored portrait mysteriously vanishes. I found myself nodding as our conveyance swayed through the traffic. The timing is certainly suggestive, but what connection could exist between the portrait restoration and Lady Wrexham's death? Ah, Watson, you have identified the crux of the matter. In my experience, portraits serve multiple purposes beyond mere aesthetic decoration. They are repositories of memory, symbols of legitimacy, and occasionally— He paused, his grey eyes taking on that distant quality that indicated intense concentration. They can serve as hiding places for documents or other items of value. A skilled restorer would have intimate access to every layer of paint, every hidden detail of a work's construction. The cab drew to a halt before an imposing Georgian townhouse, whose elegant facade spoke of substantial wealth and refined taste. Wrexham House occupied a commanding position on one of Belgravia's most prestigious squares, its windows gleaming despite the overcast afternoon, its brass fittings polished to perfection. Even in mourning, the household maintained the standards befitting a residence of such distinction. Holmes had instructed our driver to deposit us at the corner, rather than directly before the main entrance, and I soon understood his reasoning. From our position, we could observe the comings and goings at the house while remaining inconspicuous among the ordinary foot traffic of the square. "There," Holmes murmured, indicating a tall, well-dressed gentleman who was just emerging from the front door of Wrexham House. "Unless I am much mistaken, we are observing our mysterious Mr. Charles Wrexham. Note his bearing, Watson, confident to the point of arrogance, but with a slight tension about the shoulders that suggests he is not entirely at ease in his newly inherited role." The man in question appeared to be in his early 40s, as Miss Whitmore had indicated, with dark hair and pale features that bore a superficial resemblance to the classical English gentleman. Yet something in his manner struck me as slightly artificial, as though he were playing a role rather than simply being himself. "He carries himself well," I observed, "but there is something about his gait that seems studied, almost theatrical." "Precisely, Watson. Observe how he adjusts his cravat before descending the steps, a gesture that speaks of recent acquisition of fine clothing rather than lifelong familiarity with such garments. And see how he glances about before proceeding down the street. A man comfortable in his surroundings does not exhibit such caution." We followed at a discreet distance as Charles Wrexham made his way through the square and into a waiting carriage. Holmes's sharp eyes missed nothing: the manner in which the man spoke to his driver, the way he settled himself in his seat, even the direction in which his gaze lingered as the vehicle pulled away from the curb. "Most illuminating," Holmes murmured as the carriage disappeared around a corner. Now, Watson, let us see what intelligence we can gather about the late Lady Wrexham and her household. Rather than approaching Wrexham House directly, Holmes led me to a small public house on the adjacent street, the sort of establishment that catered to the servants and tradespeople of the wealthy neighbourhood. The King's Arms was warm and welcoming after our journey through the damp afternoon air, and Holmes's practised eye quickly identified several individuals whose dress and manner suggested employment in the great houses of the area. Within minutes of our arrival, Holmes had engaged a middle-aged woman in conversation. She introduced herself as Mrs. Pembroke, cook to Lord Ashworth in the neighbouring mansion, and proved to be a veritable fountain of local intelligence. "Lady Wrexham, God rest her soul," Mrs. Pembroke said, crossing herself piously, "was always a private lady, but in recent months she became almost reclusive. Sarah Whitmore, lovely girl, though perhaps too loyal for her own good, told our Ellen that her ladyship had been receiving visitors at unusual hours, gentlemen callers who came and went through the servants' entrance after dark." Holmes's interest sharpened visibly. Did Sarah mention anything about these visitors, their appearance, their business with Lady Wrexham? Not in any detail, sir, though she did say that one of them was a foreign gentleman, French perhaps, or Italian. An artist of some sort, working on that portrait of Sir Reginald that hung in the main hall. Beautiful piece of work that was, though I always thought there was something melancholy about Sir Reginald's expression. And the other visitors? Mrs. Pembroke lowered her voice conspiratorially. "There was talk of lawyers, sir, and men from the banks. Sarah said her ladyship had become quite concerned about money matters, though that seemed strange given the family's wealth. And then there was that young man who claimed to be family, though none of us had ever heard tell of him before he appeared after the funeral." Holmes exchanged a meaningful glance with me before pressing further. "This young man, Mr. Charles Wrexham, what was the general opinion of him among the household staff?" "Well, sir, he seemed pleasant enough, and he certainly knew his way around the house as though he'd been there before. But Sarah said there was something that didn't sit right with her about him. She couldn't put her finger on it, but she felt he was watching everything too carefully, as though he were memorizing the layout and contents of the rooms." We spent another hour in the King's Arms, during which Holmes masterfully drew out further details about the Wrexham household, the circumstances of Lady Cordelia's death, and the mysterious events surrounding the disappearance of the portrait. By the time we departed, we had constructed a far more detailed picture of the situation than Miss Whitmore's initial account had provided. The afternoon was growing late when Holmes finally led me to the servants' entrance of Wrexham House itself. His knock was answered by an elderly man, whose bearing and dress immediately identified him as the butler Hobson, whom Miss Whitmore had mentioned. "Good afternoon," Holmes said, producing a calling card that identified him as an insurance investigator. "I am here regarding certain questions that have arisen concerning the recent loss of valuable items from this household. Might I speak with you briefly?" Hobson's weathered features showed surprise, but he stepped aside to admit us. "I was not aware that any insurance claims had been filed, sir. Mr. Charles Wrexham mentioned the theft to Inspector Bradshaw, but he gave no indication that further investigation would be necessary." "Routine inquiry, I assure you," Holmes replied smoothly. "The insurance company merely wishes to confirm the details before processing the claim. Perhaps you could show us to the room where the portrait of Sir Reginald formerly hung." The butler led us through a series of servants' corridors into the main hall of the house, a magnificent space dominated by a grand staircase and lined with family portraits spanning several generations. The empty space where Sir Reginald's portrait had hung was immediately obvious, marked by a slightly lighter rectangle of wallpaper and the ornate gilded frame that had been left behind. "A most impressive piece," Hobson said sadly, gesturing toward the empty space. "Sir Reginald commissioned it from a distinguished artist shortly before his death. Her ladyship treasured it above all her other possessions." Holmes examined the empty frame with his magnifying glass, paying particular attention to the corners and the mechanism by which the canvas had been attached. "Most curious," he murmured. "The canvas appears to have been removed with considerable care, not the work of common thieves seeking to dispose of stolen goods quickly." "What do you make of the restoration work that was recently completed?" I asked Hobson. The butler's expression grew troubled. "Monsieur Beaumont was a most skillful craftsman, sir, and Lady Wrexham seemed pleased with his work. However, I must confess that the process disturbed the normal routine of the household considerably. Her ladyship insisted that the restoration be carried out in her private sitting room, despite the inconvenience and the strong odours from the chemical compounds he employed. Did you observe any of the restoration work yourself? On several occasions, sir. Monsieur Beaumont worked with remarkable precision, removing layers of old varnish and overpainting to reveal the original colours beneath. He explained to her ladyship that many portraits of that era had been subjected to poor restoration attempts over the years, and that his techniques would restore the work to its original condition. Holmes had moved to examine the other portraits lining the hall, his sharp eyes taking in every detail of their composition and condition. These other works, have they ever been restored? Not to my knowledge, sir. Her ladyship had always been content with their appearance as they were, yet she felt compelled to restore her late husband's portrait specifically. Did she explain her reasoning? Hobson hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of our questions. Her ladyship had become increasingly concerned with preserving Sir Reginald's memory, sir. She often spoke of ensuring that future generations would see him exactly as he had been in life. The restoration seemed to be part of that effort. Holmes nodded thoughtfully and moved toward the staircase leading to the upper floors. Might we see Lady Wrexham's private sitting room? I understand that is where she was found. I'm afraid that would not be possible, sir. Mr. Charles Wrexham has made it clear that the room is not to be disturbed. He is conducting his own inventory of his late aunt's possessions. Of course. Perhaps you might simply point out which room it is from the exterior, for our report. Hobson reluctantly led us to a window that provided a view of the rear of the house, where he indicated a set of French doors opening onto a small balcony. Her ladyship's sitting room overlooks the garden, sir. She spent most of her final weeks there, often late into the night. As we prepared to depart, Holmes casually inquired about the staff who had been dismissed prior to Lady Wrexham's death. A common precaution when illness strikes, he observed. No doubt her ladyship wished to avoid exposing her servants to any contagion. Indeed, sir, though her ladyship showed no signs of illness beyond her long-standing heart condition. She simply announced one morning that she would be reducing the household staff to essential personnel only. Several individuals who had served the family for many years were given their notice with generous severance. Holmes thanked the butler for his cooperation, and we took our leave. But rather than departing the area immediately, he led me to a small park across the square, where we could observe the rear of Wrexham House without attracting attention. "Watson," he said, settling himself on a bench with a clear view of Lady Wrexham's former sitting room, "I believe we are dealing with a conspiracy of considerable sophistication. The pieces of our puzzle are beginning to arrange themselves into a pattern, though several crucial elements remain obscure." "You suspect this Charles Wrexham is not who he claims to be?" "I suspect, my dear fellow, that Charles Wrexham is precisely who he claims to be, but that the nature of his claim is based upon a foundation of deliberate deception. Consider the evidence. A woman becomes agitated about some discovery, speaks of righting old wrongs, and dies shortly after the completion of a portrait restoration that may have revealed hidden secrets. Her heir appears immediately with documentation supporting his inheritance, while the portrait itself vanishes under circumstances that suggest careful planning rather than opportunistic theft. The afternoon light was beginning to fade when our patience was rewarded. The French doors of Lady Wrexham's sitting room opened, and Charles Wrexham himself stepped onto the small balcony, carrying what appeared to be a leather portfolio. Even at a distance, we could observe his furtive manner as he glanced about before opening the portfolio and examining its contents. "Most interesting," Holmes murmured. "Our mysterious heir appears to be conducting his own examination of Lady Wrexham's papers, and doing so in a manner that suggests he wishes to avoid observation." As we watched, Charles Wrexham removed several documents from the portfolio, holding them up to the failing light as though attempting to read some faded or obscured text. His posture suggested frustration, and we observed him shake his head repeatedly as though the documents were not yielding the information he sought. Suddenly, his attention was caught by something within the sitting room itself. He turned abruptly and disappeared from view, leaving the French doors standing open. Holmes immediately rose from our bench and moved closer to the house, gesturing for me to follow. From our new position, we could hear voices coming from the sitting room, Charles Wrexham's voice, raised in what sounded like anger or frustration, and another voice that I could not immediately identify. The conversation was too distant and muffled for us to make out individual words, but the tone was clearly argumentative. "Another visitor," Holmes whispered. "Someone who entered through the main house while Charles Wrexham was occupied with the portfolio. Most curious and most suggestive." The voices continued for perhaps 10 minutes before we heard the sound of footsteps within the house. Moments later, Charles Wrexham reappeared on the balcony, but his manner had changed dramatically. Where before he had seemed furtive but confident, he now appeared genuinely distressed. He clutched the portfolio to his chest and looked about with obvious anxiety before retreating into the sitting room and closing the French doors firmly behind him. Holmes remained motionless for several minutes, his keen eyes fixed upon the now darkened windows of the sitting room. Finally, he turned to me with an expression of grim satisfaction. "Watson, I believe we have just witnessed a crack in the facade of our mysterious conspiracy. Charles Wrexham has received news that has shaken his confidence considerably. The question now is whether this development will drive him to further desperate measures or cause him to abandon his scheme entirely." As we made our way back through the darkening streets toward Baker Street, Holmes outlined his preliminary conclusions regarding the case. "We are dealing with a carefully orchestrated fraud, Watson, one that likely began with the restoration of Sir Reginald's portrait. Monsieur Beaumont, I suspect, discovered something hidden within the painting, perhaps a document or other evidence that called into question the legitimacy of Charles Wrexham's claim to the inheritance. But if Beaumont discovered evidence against Wrexham, why did he not expose the fraud? Because, my dear fellow, I believe Monsieur Beaumont was not an innocent art restorer who stumbled upon evidence of fraud, but rather an active participant in the conspiracy. Consider the timing. He completes his work. Lady Wrexham dies. Charles Wrexham appears with his claim and the portrait vanishes. Each element serves the others in a sequence too convenient to be coincidental. Then Lady Wrexham's death was indeed murder." Holmes paused at the entrance to our lodgings, his gaunt features highlighted by the gas lamp's flickering glow. "I believe Lady Cordelia Wrexham died because she discovered the truth about Charles Wrexham's identity and the nature of the evidence hidden in her husband's portrait. Whether her death was accomplished through poison, shock, or some other means remains to be determined. But I am convinced that she was murdered to prevent her from exposing a fraud that would have cost the conspirators a fortune." As we climbed the familiar 17 steps to our rooms, I found myself contemplating the magnitude of the case we had undertaken. If Holmes's theories proved correct, we were confronting not merely a simple inheritance fraud, but a complex conspiracy involving forgery, identity theft, and murder, crimes that struck at the very foundations of English law and social order. The evening brought news that confirmed Holmes's darkest suspicions. Inspector Bradshaw of Scotland Yard arrived at our lodgings near midnight, his usual composure shaken by developments he could not fully explain. "Mr. Holmes," he said, accepting the brandy I offered with trembling hands, "I fear I owe you an apology. You were right to question the circumstances surrounding Lady Wrexham's death. This evening we discovered the body of a man in the Thames near Westminster Bridge. He had been stabbed through the heart, and his identification papers suggest he was one Monsieur Henri Beaumont, a French art restorer who had been working in London." Holmes leaned forward intently. "When was the body discovered?" "Just after the evening tide, sir. The police surgeon estimates he had been in the water for less than 12 hours. Most curious of all, he was found with this clutched in his hand." Bradshaw reached into his coat and produced a small piece of canvas, paint-stained and torn at the edges. It appears to be a fragment of an oil painting, possibly from a portrait, judging by the flesh tones visible in the pigment. Holmes examined the fragment with his magnifying glass, his expression growing increasingly grave. "Inspector, I fear this case has taken a decidedly darker turn. Monsieur Beaumont's death suggests that the conspiracy we are investigating is willing to employ violence to protect their secrets. We must move quickly before further harm comes to those who might possess knowledge of the truth." The discovery of Monsieur Beaumont's body transformed our investigation from a matter of suspected fraud into a case of undeniable murder. Holmes spent the remainder of that night in feverish activity, dispatching telegrams to contacts throughout London and the continent, while I found sleep impossible as the implications of our case continued to unfold. Dawn brought fresh intelligence that served to deepen rather than resolve the mystery. A telegram from Paris confirmed that Henri Beaumont had indeed been a respected art restorer, but one who had fallen into financial difficulties in recent months. More disturbing still was the news that several other art experts across Europe had died under suspicious circumstances over the past year, all of them specialists in portrait restoration from the Georgian period. "Watson," Holmes announced over our morning breakfast, his grey eyes blazing with the intensity that marked his most focused investigations, "we are confronting not merely a single crime, but what appears to be a systematic campaign of murder designed to eliminate individuals with the expertise to detect a particular form of artistic fraud." I set down my cup of coffee with trembling hands. "Good God, Holmes. Are you suggesting that Charles Wrexham and his associates have been killing art experts across Europe?" "I am suggesting, my dear fellow, that we have stumbled upon a conspiracy of international scope, one that has been in operation for considerably longer than we initially suspected. Consider the pattern. Lady Wrexham commissions the restoration of her husband's portrait from a financially desperate expert. During the restoration process, something is discovered that threatens to expose a fraud. The expert is eliminated, the evidence is destroyed or concealed, and the fraud proceeds as planned." Holmes moved to his desk and spread out several sheets of paper covered with his precise handwriting. "I have been corresponding with colleagues in Edinburgh, Dublin, and Amsterdam. In each city, wealthy families have recently discovered previously unknown heirs who have claimed substantial inheritances based upon documentation that emerged during the restoration of family portraits. In each case, the art expert who performed the restoration has subsequently died under circumstances that appeared natural or accidental." The magnitude of what Holmes was suggesting left me momentarily speechless. But such a conspiracy would require years of planning, extensive knowledge of genealogy and law, and resources far beyond those of common criminals. "Precisely, Watson. We are dealing with individuals of exceptional intelligence and considerable financial backing. The question that remains is whether Charles Wrexham is the mastermind of this operation or merely another pawn in a larger game." Our discussion was interrupted by the arrival of Miss Whitmore, whose appearance suggested that she had passed as sleepless a night as we had. Her usually neat attire was dishevelled, and her face bore the marks of considerable distress. "Mr. Holmes," she said, accepting the chair I offered her with evident relief, "I fear I am in terrible danger. Last night someone attempted to break into my lodgings. I heard them trying the lock for several minutes before they gave up and departed. I am convinced they were searching for something, but I cannot imagine what they might want from me." Holmes leaned forward intently. "Miss Whitmore, I need you to think very carefully. During your years of service to Lady Wrexham, did she ever entrust you with any documents, letters, or other items that she asked you to keep safe?" The young woman's face paled. "Why, yes, Mr. Holmes. Just a week before her death, my lady gave me a sealed envelope and asked me to keep it in my personal belongings. She said that if anything should happen to her, I was to deliver it to her solicitor, Mr. Pemberton. But with all the confusion following her death, and Mr. Charles Wrexham's immediate assumption of authority over the estate, I forgot about it entirely until this moment." "Do you still have this envelope?" "Yes, sir. I carry it with me always, sewn into the lining of my coat as my lady instructed." Holmes's eyes lit up with triumph. "Miss Whitmore, you may well be carrying the key to this entire mystery. However, given the attempt upon your lodgings, I fear you are indeed in considerable danger. Dr. Watson will escort you to a place of safety, while I examine the contents of Lady Wrexham's final message." Within the hour, I had settled Miss Whitmore in secure accommodations with Mrs. Hudson's sister in Kensington, with strict instructions to admit no visitors and to send word immediately if anyone attempted to contact her. Upon my return to Baker Street, I found Holmes hunched over his desk, examining a collection of documents with his magnifying glass. "Watson," he said without looking up, Lady Cordelia Wrexham was a remarkably perceptive woman. The envelope contained not only a letter explaining her suspicions about Charles Wrexham, but also copies of documents she had discovered hidden within the restoration of her husband's portrait. He handed me a sheet of paper covered in Lady Wrexham's elegant handwriting. The letter, dated just 3 days before her death, revealed the full extent of her discoveries. My dear Mr. Pemberton, if you are reading this letter, then my worst fears have been realized, and I have died before I could expose the fraud that threatens to destroy my late husband's memory and rob his legitimate heirs of their inheritance. During the restoration of Reginald's portrait, Monsieur Beaumont discovered documents that had been concealed within the canvas itself, documents that I now believe were placed there by my husband before his death. These papers reveal that the Charles Wrexham, who has recently contacted me claiming to be Reginald's nephew, is an impostor. The real Charles Wrexham died of fever in Bombay in 1878, as recorded in the official colonial records. The man who has assumed his identity is, I believe, one Marcus Fielding, a convicted forger who escaped from Pentonville prison 18 months ago. More shocking still, the hidden documents reveal that Reginald had discovered evidence of Fielding's criminal activities shortly before his own death. Fielding had been operating under various aliases, creating false genealogies and forged documents to support fraudulent inheritance claims across Europe. Reginald intended to expose him, but died before he could act upon his knowledge. I fear that Fielding has learned of my discovery and means to silence me as he has silenced others. If harm comes to me, please ensure that these documents reach the proper authorities and that justice is finally served. Holmes set aside the letter and showed me the accompanying documents, genealogical charts, prison records, and correspondence that painted a detailed picture of Marcus Fielding's criminal career. Lady Wrexham's research was remarkably thorough, Watson. She had not only identified the false Charles Wrexham, but had traced his connection to similar frauds across the continent. Then we have the evidence needed to expose him, I said with relief. Indeed we do. However, Fielding's desperation makes him extraordinarily dangerous. The murder of Monsieur Beaumont proves that he will kill to protect his secret. We must proceed with extreme caution. Holmes began pacing before our fireplace, his hands clasped behind his back in the manner that indicated he was formulating a plan. Fielding knows that Lady Wrexham discovered his identity, but he cannot be certain how much evidence she preserved or with whom she shared her knowledge. His attempt to burglarize Miss Whitmore's lodgings suggests that he suspects she possesses damaging information. What do you propose we do? We shall set a trap, Watson, one that will force Fielding to reveal himself while providing us with the opportunity to apprehend him safely. Inspector Bradshaw must be informed of our discoveries, but we cannot rely upon official channels alone. Fielding has thus far demonstrated remarkable skill at avoiding detection by the authorities. The plan Holmes devised was as audacious as it was dangerous. We would arrange for word to reach Fielding that Miss Whitmore possessed documents that could expose his fraud, but that she was willing to sell her silence for a substantial sum. The exchange would take place at Wrexham House itself, in Lady Cordelia's former sitting room, a location that would provide both symbolic justice and practical advantages for our purposes. Inspector Bradshaw, initially skeptical of our unorthodox approach, was convinced by the evidence Lady Wrexham had preserved. "Mr. Holmes," he said, examining the documents with growing amazement, "this Marcus Fielding appears to be one of the most dangerous criminals of our time. If your plan succeeds in apprehending him, you will have prevented dozens of future crimes." The trap was set for the following evening. Word was carefully leaked through criminal contacts that Miss Whitmore sought a private meeting with Charles Wrexham to discuss certain documents that had come into her possession. The meeting was arranged for 10 o'clock, ostensibly to provide cover of darkness for the transaction. Holmes and I positioned ourselves in the garden behind Wrexham House well before the appointed time, with Inspector Bradshaw and several constables concealed at strategic points around the property. The night was moonless and fog-shrouded, providing excellent cover for our surveillance while creating an appropriately dramatic atmosphere for the confrontation we anticipated. At precisely 10 o'clock, we observed a figure approaching the French doors of Lady Wrexham's sitting room. Even in the dim light, I could see that it was indeed the man we had observed earlier, the false Charles Wrexham, alias Marcus Fielding. His movements were cautious but confident, suggesting that he believed himself to be in complete control of the situation. The sitting room had been arranged to appear as though Miss Whitmore awaited him within, with candles providing just enough illumination to create convincing shadows. Fielding entered without hesitation, his voice carrying clearly through the open French doors. "Miss Whitmore, I have come as you requested. I trust you have the documents you mentioned?" Holmes had positioned himself near the doorway, ready to spring our trap at the optimal moment. However, Fielding's next words revealed that he had suspected deception from the beginning. Or perhaps I should address myself to Mr. Sherlock Holmes, whose reputation for theatrical dramatics precedes him throughout London's criminal underworld. Holmes stepped into the candlelight, his lean figure casting long shadows across the room. "Marcus Fielding, I presume? Or do you prefer to maintain the pretense of being Charles Wrexham?" Fielding laughed, a sound entirely devoid of humour. "Oh, Mr. Holmes, you have no idea how long I have looked forward to this meeting. Your interference in my affairs has cost me considerable time and money. I had hoped to complete my business in London and depart for more favourable climes before you became involved." "Your business, as you call it, included the murder of Lady Cordelia Wrexham and Monsieur Henri Beaumont. Did you truly believe such crimes would go undetected?" "Lady Wrexham's death was regrettable, but necessary. The foolish woman had discovered evidence that threatened years of careful planning. As for Beaumont, he became greedy and attempted to blackmail me. Such betrayals cannot be tolerated in my line of work." I could see that Holmes was manoeuvring to position himself between Fielding and the French doors, cutting off his most obvious escape route. However, our quarry had clearly anticipated such tactics. "I must compliment your research, Mr. Holmes. Lady Wrexham's letter was quite comprehensive in its accusations. Fortunately, she failed to realize that I had already taken precautions against exposure." "What precautions?" Holmes asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. Fielding smiled coldly and produced a small revolver from his coat. "The precaution of ensuring that no witnesses survive to testify against me. You see, gentlemen, this entire affair has served as an excellent opportunity to eliminate not only the immediate threats to my operation, but also the one detective whose reputation for solving impossible cases has long been an annoyance to my profession." "You cannot hope to escape," Holmes said calmly. "The house is surrounded by police officers, and your every crime has been documented with evidence that will ensure your conviction." "Perhaps not, Mr. Holmes, but I can ensure that you will not live to see that conviction obtained." Fielding raised his weapon, but before he could fire, the room was suddenly plunged into darkness as someone extinguished the candles. In the confusion that followed, I heard the sound of a struggle, a cry of pain, and the clatter of the revolver falling to the floor. When Inspector Bradshaw's men succeeded in restoring light to the room, we found Holmes standing over the prone form of Marcus Fielding, who had been rendered unconscious by a blow from one of Lady Wrexham's own fireplace implements. "Most satisfactory," Holmes said, brushing dust from his coat, "though I must admit that the assistance of our hidden ally was most welcome." "Hidden ally?" I asked in confusion. "Miss Whitmore, of course. Did you truly believe I would place her in a comfortable hotel when her courage and intimate knowledge of this house made her invaluable to our enterprise? She has been concealed in the servants' passage behind this room throughout our conversation, ready to create a diversion at the crucial moment." Indeed, Miss Whitmore emerged from a concealed door, her face flushed with excitement and triumph. "I could not bear the thought of that monster escaping justice after what he did to my dear lady," she said. "When I heard him confess to her murder, I knew I had to act." The arrest of Marcus Fielding brought to light the full extent of his criminal enterprise. Under interrogation, he revealed details of fraudulent inheritance schemes spanning half a dozen countries, involving forged documents, false identities, and the systematic murder of art experts who might have detected his deceptions. The recovery of the stolen portrait of Sir Reginald Wrexham from a warehouse in Southwark provided the final evidence needed to secure his conviction. The portrait itself proved to be a masterpiece of criminal ingenuity. Hidden within the layers of paint and canvas were not only the original documents that Sir Reginald had concealed before his death, but also additional evidence that Fielding had accumulated over years of criminal activity. Monsieur Beaumont's restoration work had indeed revealed these secrets, but rather than exposing Fielding, the unfortunate art expert had attempted to use the knowledge for his own benefit, a decision that ultimately cost him his life. The trial of Marcus Fielding became one of the most sensational criminal proceedings of the decade, with evidence presented of crimes spanning several years and multiple countries. His conviction on charges of murder, fraud and conspiracy brought justice not only for Lady Cordelia Wrexham and Henry Beaumont, but for numerous other victims whose deaths had previously been attributed to natural causes or accidents. Miss Sarah Whitmore, whose courage and loyalty had been instrumental in exposing the conspiracy, was rewarded with a substantial settlement from the recovered assets of Fielding's criminal enterprise. She used these funds to establish a small school for the children of domestic servants, a fitting memorial to her beloved mistress and a testament to the triumph of loyalty and justice over greed and deception. As Holmes and I reflected upon the case in the comfort of our Baker Street lodgings, I found myself marveling at the complexity of the criminal mind we had encountered. It was a scheme of remarkable sophistication, I observed. The systematic targeting of wealthy families, the creation of false genealogies, the elimination of potential witnesses, Fielding possessed a criminal intelligence of the highest order. Holmes nodded thoughtfully. Indeed, Watson. Yet his very intelligence proved to be his undoing. Had he been content with simpler frauds, he might have continued his depredations indefinitely. It was his ambition to create the perfect crime that ultimately exposed him to detection. And what of the voices Miss Whitmore heard the night Lady Wrexham died? How do you explain that particular mystery? Holmes smiled, that enigmatic smile I knew so well. Ah, Watson, that was perhaps the most ingenious aspect of Fielding's scheme. He had discovered the location of the hidden documents during his reconnaissance of the house and had concealed himself within the servants' passages that honeycomb these old London mansions. By speaking through the wall behind the portrait, he created the illusion that the painting itself was communicating with Lady Wrexham, a psychological manipulation designed to convince her that she was experiencing supernatural phenomena rather than human deception. But she was not deceived. No, she was not. Lady Cordelia Wrexham possessed both the intelligence to recognize fraud and the courage to confront it. Her death was the direct result of her refusal to be intimidated by Fielding's theatrics. As the fog lifted from the streets of London and the first light of dawn crept through our windows, I found myself reflecting upon the strange concatenation of events that had brought justice to the perpetrators of the affair of the widow's portrait. A loyal servant's suspicions, a hidden letter, a murdered art expert, and Holmes's remarkable powers of deduction had combined to expose one of the most sophisticated criminal conspiracies of our age. The case served as a reminder that even in our modern world of science and reason, there existed individuals whose capacity for evil was limited only by their imagination and opportunity. Yet it also demonstrated that truth, however carefully concealed, would ultimately emerge when pursued by those with the courage to seek it and the wisdom to recognize it. In years to come, I would often think of Lady Cordelia Wrexham and her determination to protect her husband's memory from those who would exploit it for their own gain. Her final letter, hidden within the lining of a servant's coat, had become the instrument of justice, proof that even in death the righteous could triumph over the corrupt. The portrait of Sir Reginald, once restored to its proper place in Wrexham House, served as a silent testament to the complex relationship between art and truth, beauty and deception. Its layers of paint and hidden secrets reminded all who viewed it that appearances, however convincing, could never long conceal the reality that lay beneath. Holmes, for his part, pronounced himself well satisfied with the resolution of the case. "We have struck a blow against international crime, Watson," he said as he settled into his chair with his pipe and the morning papers. "Marcus Fielding's network of associates will find their operations considerably more difficult now that their methods have been exposed. And you, Holmes, what effect has this case had upon your own perspective?" He was silent for a long moment, contemplating the swirling smoke from his pipe. "I have been reminded, my dear fellow, that the greatest crimes are often those that strike at the very foundations of social order, family relationships, inheritance rights, the bonds of trust that hold civilization together. Fielding's conspiracy was not merely theft on a grand scale, but an attack upon the certainties that allow people to live and plan and hope for the future. As I set down my pen after recording the final details of our investigation, I reflected upon the strange irony that a case which had begun with reports of supernatural voices had ultimately been resolved through the most rational application of scientific method and logical deduction. The affair of the widow's portrait had tested not only Holmes's detective abilities, but also our faith in the fundamental principle that truth, however artfully concealed, would eventually emerge into the light. In that emergence, justice had been served, the innocent had been protected, and the guilty had been brought to account for their crimes. It was, I reflected, a satisfactory conclusion to one of the most complex and dangerous cases of our long partnership, one that would remain in my memory as a testament to the power of courage, loyalty, and unwavering determination in the face of seemingly insurmountable evil.